Hey guys, it's Bruce,
And I'm Casey.
and we are standing in front of a $30,000 camera and using it to hold up Casey's iPhone because the damn thing doesn't work. So, we're here to talk to you about counseling interventions. What to keep in mind when counseling African American clients. Now, here's the disclaimer, guys. This is generalized, generally speaking. Okay, we have to take everything on a case-by-case basis, but certain things that we can kind of keep in mind as we counsel African American clients. So let's start. Okay, so characteristics of a competent multicultural counselor. What are we looking to be as counselors? Well, across the board, we want to be able to demonstrate empathy, to understand our own limitations and biases, which really are going to come into play here. I mean, we're trying to expand our worldview, right? We want to fight against social injustices, and honestly, as we deal with issues like racism and discrimination, in particular with African Americans, we're going to see that this is something that comes up a lot. We're also going to need to understand that the client's values may not match our own values. Okay? Finally, we want to have willingness and openness to learn about various cultures, ethnicities, and their traditions. So we're going to try and give you a little bit of insight into some of the traditions of African Americans, some of the things they need to go through. But to give you an idea of, well, how they might experience the world, because to best serve our clients, we must understand the way they perceive and experience the world. We thought we'd give you some insight. So please watch this video. And if for some reason it doesn't really sound that great on here, here's the link for it. Please follow along.
A lot of people talk about racial prejudice, and some people have gone so far as to say that there are actually two Americas, one black and one white. But talk is cheap. So I decided to look at the problem myself, firsthand, to go underground and actually experience America as a white man. I hired the best makeup people in the business. If I was going to pass as a white man, everything had to be perfect.
I think that's like going down. Okay, let's try this. This, the other kind of Harry Reeves-ish, I like.
I studied for my role very carefully. I watched lots of Dynasty. See how they walk? Their butts are real tight when they walk. They keep their butts tight. I gotta remember to keep my butt real tight when I walk. And I read a whole bunch of Hallmark cards.
You always mean lots more to me than you could ever guess, for you have done so much to fill my life with happiness.
Finally, I was ready. What are you doing?
I'm buying this newspaper.
That's all right. There's nobody around. Go ahead, take it. Take it. Go ahead. Take it. Yeah, take it. Take it. Slowly I began to realize that when white people are alone, they give things to each other for free. There was only one other black man on the bus. He got off on 45th Street. problem is much more serious than I ever imagined.
Now, let me get this straight, Mr. White. You'd like to borrow $50,000 from my bank, but you have no collateral. You have no credit. You don't even have any ID. Is that correct?
That's right.
Mr. White, I'm sorry. This is not a charity. This is a business.
Harry, why don't you take your break now? I'll take care of Mr. White.
Well, okay. Thanks, Bob.
That was a close one. We don't have to bother with these formalities, do we, Mr. White?
What a silly Negro.
Just take what you want, Mr. White. Pay us back any time, or don't. We don't care.
Tell me, do you know of any other banks like this in this area?
So what did I learn from all of this? Well, I learned that we still have a very long way to go in this country before all men are truly equal. But I'll tell you something. I got a lot of friends. And we've got a lot of makeup. So the next time you're hugging up with some really super groovy white guy, or even a really great super keen white chick, don't be too sure. It might be black.
Okay. So, to be honest, when we started thinking about ways to work on this project, we were trying to figure out funny ways to hook people in. And I thought of this sketch. Now, this sketch was from 1984. I was 13. I remember this, probably most of you, with the exception of maybe Dr. Hall, probably had no idea this thing existed. Anyway, when I saw it when I was 13, I thought this was hilarious. It was really funny. I didn't actually look at it through the lens I'm looking at it now. Now it actually, in a way, kind of made me a little sad, that there's truth in jest. So the way that Eddie Murphy goes around poking fun at really this power dynamic, I mean, it's still here. It's still here, and it's overt. So in a way, it's kind of showing you the perception that's really out there of how things are. There really is a white stratification, a whiteness of society, and this power dynamic does put African Americans on a lower tier, really based on nothing. So let's talk about, say, false social structures. The idea of racism versus perceived racism. Race. Well, what is race? It is a social construction. We talked a little bit about this in class. It's created to differentiate racial groups and show the superiority or dominance of one race, and typically that's whites, over other groups. And in this dynamic, minority groups are subordinate to the majority in terms of power and privilege, and we saw that in the video, right? The only difference between anybody in the bus and the bank was color. And those who were white had more of the power and privilege. They are in positions of authority in every aspect. They were the store owners, the bank managers, and this is the dynamic that kind of comes into play. Racism, prejudice, discrimination, antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Again, talking about this power dynamic, and a false belief that just based really on your ethnicity or your cultural background, that one division is better than another. Perceived racism is a little bit different. Perceived racism is the subjective experience that somebody feels. It's a subjective experience of prejudice and or discrimination. It's your belief of experiencing a racist or not a racist act. For example, Casey didn't hold the door for me because I'm white. Well, that's my experience, that's my belief, but Casey might just not have held the door for me because she didn't know I was there. If I already had this belief, I have a perception of racism. Now, it might be true. Casey might not like white people. Casey might not like me. But my experience of it is my perception of racism either way. In particular for African Americans, these are some of the dynamics that African Americans have to contend with, culturally speaking, in the United States. For African Americans to survive and thrive in American society, they often have to overcome experiences with racism and perceived racism. Now, one of these surveys, this statistic, between 31 and 100% of African Americans experienced a form of racism in the past year. I want to qualify this a little bit. This is from a cross-section of roughly 100 studies of participating African Americans who were asked, had they experienced racism. So across these multiple studies, at a minimum 31% of the respondents and all up to 100%, depending on the study, had experienced a form of racism in the past year. Now, this number, this flatline number, if they extended that over to lifetime experience of racism, kept going up. As a matter of fact, over 90% of respondents experienced some type of racist event in their lifetime. And out of these respondents, of these studies, 9% of African Americans, only 9%, feel that they're treated the same as whites. So there is a very real feeling of a power differential. And I think it's more than just a feeling. So, experiencing racial discrimination, in particular, developmentally speaking, think about this, as you're entering your teen years, experiencing racial discrimination from ages 16 to 18, as you're approaching your adult life, well, if you get hit with a lot of racist experience, it predicts depressive symptoms by the time of age 20. Well, why? Okay, well, think about it. As we're going through development, we're developing our self-concept, self-esteem, and, yes, our racial identities. African Americans' development of self-esteem is very closely related to their racial identity and to the impact of discrimination. Now, the racial self-concept is self-esteem and shyness. So someone who has a higher self-esteem, higher self-concept is less shy. They're more actively engaged with other people. They're more likely to interact with other people. And with higher self-esteem comes these better mental health, becoming more resilient in the faces of adversity, right? But those with low self-esteem, they have fewer coping skills, poor mental health, and are less resilient across the board. Now, for African Americans who don't feel inferior, prejudiced, or discriminated against because of being black, they have more internal resources to maintain low psychological distress. They can cope better with adversity, with psychological distress. They can cope. Now, in this development concept, experiences with racism, it undermines the racial self-concept. So, what happens? Well, racism devalues aspects of the person that they identify with their racial group. You know, in case of African Americans, perhaps, you know, their coarse hair might be more likely to be indicative of being African American. All right? If so many people make fun of it, they start to devalue this piece of their racial identity. Well, if they do this, devaluation leads to depression. And the more instances of racism lead to higher psychological distress. It becomes a cycle that undermines self-esteem, and the cycle continues. So African Americans who either experience or perceive more racism, or both, really they are tied closely, may be more vulnerable to shyness and distress, becoming more introverted, less engaged. So, in terms of the self-concept, we talked about devaluation leading to depression. Well, African Americans are prone to depression. I mean, we all are. As a matter of fact, there's a similar lifetime prevalence in terms of rates of depression, major depressive disorder, between African Americans and Caucasians. However, African Americans have depressive episodes that are more disabling, more persistent, and more treatment resistant. Go back to that for a second, Casey. In terms of disabling, we're talking about really not being able to deal with life, all right? Not being able to deal with running the house, working in a job, having relationships, socialization, all right? Think about it. It's more persistent. It lasts longer. And it's harder to treat. And there's a few reasons for that. We'll get more deeper into that. Okay, well, what are the contributions made that can affect depression? What are the different forms of racism that African Americans can experience? Racial microstressors and microaggressions. Now, face value, they look very similar, and they truly are. The true difference here is microstressors are really aligned with the experience. Like perceived racism is the person's experience. Microstressors are the experiences of the person that deal with racism. And these include being ignored, being overlooked, being mistreated. They're acts experienced. Now, racial microaggressions are, well, acts committed by others. Right? These racial microaggressions are brief, commonplace, daily indignities that communicate hostile, derogatory, negative racial slights and insults to the person. And these can be verbal, behavioral, or environmental. Within the idea of microaggressions, subtypes of these, microassaults. Now, these are really more overt, and they go more towards being, verbal or behavioral. An example of this is, if an African American is walking one way down the street, a woman's walking down the other. She sees him, doesn't say anything, and just crosses the street. It's not an overt act of racism, meaning it's not, yelling out an expletive, not horribly in your face, but it still has impact. Right? If the person sees that happen, they're going to assume there's a good chance they could make an assumption that that it's a racially motivated move, that this behavior happened. All right. Micro insult. These are insensitive behaviors that degrade a person's racial heritage or identity. And these are really, again, more actions-like, but they're insulting. All right. Saying an Asian American person speaks good English. Or in instances with African Americans, which does happen, where the store owner follows the person around, just to make sure that nothing gets stolen. Micro-invalidations. Now, these are acts of negation, when denying thoughts, feelings, or experience of a person of color. And the big one lately, all lives matter. Black lives matter. All lives matter. You're missing the point. Right? That is a micro-invalidation. Okay. So these are some of the things that African Americans have to deal with in terms of race, microaggressions, elements. Now, what about dynamics of treatment? How do we treat African Americans and get them into a clinical experience? Well, let's look at the percentage of African Americans who actively seek mental health services. In this 2010 study, 7.4% of African American men, 12% of African American women, and if it's Caribbean African American, a little bit higher percentage, 11.3 and 8.5. But these are really pretty low percentages of services sought after. The services range from emotional, nervous, mental health, or substance use. The higher end is substance use, but still it's a low percentage of help seeking. We'll get deeper into why that might be in a minute, but the percentage of African Americans with a diagnosis who actually get adequate mental health care, this was a little bit scary. Adequate mental health care. 14% of these people that sought treatment, so 14% of the 7.4, got adequate treatment. Now, adequate here is defined as 4 sessions. The normal level of adequacy is at least 8 sessions. So African Americans, on average, are getting half of that. What does it say in terms of, treatment resistance? How effective can we be as counselors? Well, what prevents African Americans from getting the treatment they need? There are both issues at the systemic level and at the individual level. First thing is poor access. It's hard for African Americans to get services. Some reasons: lack of health insurance. Obamacare has eased that a little bit, but not much. A low availability of mental health services, right? That is true, particularly in certain demographic areas. There's also a cultural mistrust of healthcare providers. If you think about it, look at the history of the relationship of the United States healthcare system with African Americans. Historically, African Americans have been disabused to a certain extent, definitely more than Caucasians. If you think about the Tuskegee Airmen, that whole experiment, right? Things like that are going to breed a mistrust. And African Americans, are more likely to use psychiatric emergency services. So you're talking about an extreme level where the care really, it's not meant for long-term mental health. It's more crisis, which makes follow-up and ease of continuation of care a lot more challenging. Concerns over misdiagnosis and clinician bias. Now, more African Americans are diagnosed with schizophrenia and psychosis. Like, it's a disproportionate level of diagnosis. They are more often proportionally diagnosed with schizophrenia or psychosis over regular mood disorders than Caucasians. Part of the reason might be because African Americans, in particular men, are more likely to somaticize ailments with physical ailments, body issues, stomach issues, things of that sort. It might throw off the diagnosis a bit. Also, African Americans have, in general, a more view of looking for community-based services versus individualized type healthcare. So they're more likely to lean on family, friends, community, faith-based organizations, and social supports, again, generally speaking. And then, for men, masculinity norms. This isn't just for African American men, but it does apply here. Men are less likely to seek treatment. Men are supposed to tough it out. So all of these things serve as impacts at a systemic level for African Americans to get treatment. Individual issues. Well, there's a limited knowledge of mental illness and treatment options in general from this demographic. And according to the research we did, it's legitimately caused by a lack of open discussion in the African American community of what mental illness is. Additionally, there's already some self-stigma going on here. One of the great quotes that I read here was, "We feel like we're already at the bottom because we're black, and showing everyone you may not be stable in your mind is completely out of the question." So there's a weakness associated with having mental illness and a loss of additional self-esteem for fear of that. Now, fear of consequences, and this is very real, and we need to keep this in consideration. A national survey found that African American men believe that mental illness is chronic, debilitating, and can have major negative consequences, including being placed in prison or in inpatient psychiatric care. And 46% of prisoners are African American, while only comprising 13% of the population. African American men are more likely to be involuntarily committed to either prison or to inpatient from police action. And now Casey's going to jump in, and we're going to switch.
Okay. So we have sort of what it's like to be the African American client. What is it like to be an African American sitting in the chair as a client? How do race and ethnicity affect the client's experience of mental health treatment? So assume we get them there, we get you to the office, to the hospital, to the counseling session. Clients report that they do assess race and ethnicity of the counselor in the first counseling session above everything else. So yes, your client is looking at you, they are looking at your skin color, they are wondering if you will be able to relate to them. There's other research that shows that counselors who directly addressed racial issues in the first 2 sessions of a 12-session counseling experience reported creating an environment conducive to building a strong therapeutic relationship. So this isn't a topic that a counselor wants to avoid. It does show that race isn't an off the table or off limits topic for you. You're not intimidated by it. Clients who perceive that a therapist is intimidated by it are less likely to bring it up. And if if they perceive you to be prejudiced in any way or scared of the topic, they're less likely to bring it up. If they think that you don't want to talk about it as a counselor, they're probably not going to bring it up as a client. So counselors need to become aware of their automatic prejudice, and this is often unconscious. There's a quote here: individuals can sincerely hold egalitarian values and view themselves as low in prejudice, yet at an automatic level, they can still demonstrate harmful prejudicial associations. These are things you might not even realize you're doing, and it's honestly from intimidation, a lack of comfort in dealing with other cultures or ethnicities. It's something that needs to be practiced, it needs to be worked on, but first you need to be aware of it. Oftentimes there is reduced eye contact, less smiling, less direct physical contact with the minority group member, increased eye blinking, and speech errors. Again, often unconscious. It's something that a lot of us don't realize they're doing, and it does come with practice, with awareness. These physical interactions may likely be unconscious, and they are influenced by cultural learning, and they are resistant to introspection. Go ahead. Counselor considerations. African American clients may be more reserved or shy in the presence of a perceived oppressor. So, of course, that doesn't seem fair, but to you, to them, they're looking at the people who have oppressed them. They are viewing you as someone unrelatable. A white counselor must be aware of their own privilege. You cannot deny white privilege and expect to get anywhere with an African American client. You have to consider the worldviews. Addressing diversity issues with a client can increase your credibility and rapport. If you adopt a colorblind attitude, it serves to perpetuate blatant forms of discrimination by denying it exists. Bruce had just talked about this, micro-invalidations, pretending, saying, I don't see color. Well, no one wants to hear that. It's simply not true, and you might not see color, but the rest of the world does, and that needs to be addressed and considered in your therapy sessions. Instead, you can acknowledge discrimination as a means to reflect on both your client and your own personal biases, and you can strengthen rapport through appropriate self-disclosure. The counselor must understand the client and their own stage of racial identity development for this to be effective. Narrative storytelling, which is that's an African American tradition. Well, it's a tradition within a lot of cultures, but it is particularly strong in the African American community of using art and language and songs to kind of pass down traditions, pass down stories. And studying that does provide a counselor with a detailed client worldview, and it empowers clients to tell their own story and helps the counselor to understand potential defense mechanisms. Encouragement. Encouraged persons have an adequate and positive view of the self and others, an openness to experience and a sense of belonging, and believe they are worthwhile despite how well or poorly they do and what others think of them. This goes back to what Bruce was saying about self-esteem, about self-image, about racial identity and validation, and basically an overall feeling of self-worth.
We are looking to encourage our clients.
Always looking to encourage the clients. Promoting encouragement. Racial socialization, orienting children to values, norms, and ways of being within the family, the community, and the world. So this kind of starts with parents or family, and it is something that needs to be talked about in a family and in a therapeutic setting. What to expect of the world? How do you fit into the world? A lot of times these topics are ignored, and in a minority group especially, it can't be. So as a parent, as a counselor, you have to acknowledge these things. Ignoring them does nobody any good. It has to take place in the family. What does it mean to be African American in society? And it does provide a positive foundation for African American children. And this doesn't have to be a negative thing. This doesn't have to be a parent telling a child constantly how hard it is to be black and to expect discrimination. It can be some of that. It can be encouragement. It can be, you know, being proud of your heritage and instilling self-worth, which obviously is something you want to discuss in, you know, any ethnicity, any, you know, culture. Spirituality, this is a major source of support that keeps African Americans strong and persevering in the face of obstacles. This can be with or without religiosity, and this is an integral part of self-development and helps develop encouragement. We have ethnic pride. How does a person feel about belonging to that group? Back to racial socialization. How did your parents raise you? What does the world tell you about what it means to be black? So this is how a person feels about their ethnicity. High ethnic pride obviously is going to correlate to higher levels of self-esteem, increased sense of belonging, an increased awareness of oppression, and self-efficacy. Can help to refute racist messages and protect healthy self-concept. So you're coping with any negative, you know, media, negative messages from the world, you know, that your value is lesser than. You are learning to cope, and if you have these coping mechanisms, you're able to, you know, take in the knowledge and, you know, kind of let it out the other end.
So really, we're looking to tap into these areas of support for African Americans as means to offer them additional ways to cope and feel better about themselves by tapping the things that they naturally tap into or would naturally tap into more often. It's just, again, means of developing self-support and pride in their heritage.
Low ethnic prides, on the opposite end, are going to lead to feelings of self-doubt, self-negativity, and self-mistrust by buying into and internalizing the negative expectations of society. So what are the clinical implications of all of this? You want to encourage your clients to talk about their experiences and perceptions of racism. This goes back to everything we were saying about being an African American client and feeling that your counselor is not willing to or is afraid to talk about these topics. You absolutely cannot be. You have to encourage your clients to talk about their experiences and their perceptions. You don't have to agree with them. You have to listen. Provide psychoeducational materials to help African Americans know that racism does affect mental health. Demonstrate empathy, understanding to negative realities of life to African American clients. You have to be open to the fact that a white life and a black life are simply just not going to be the same. A African American experience in this world is not the same as a Caucasian experience in this world, and you have to empathize with that. You have to show that you understand that. Family counseling, you can encourage the whole family to come in. That can include friends. It can include anybody close to the individual, because obviously we did talk about
Collectivism.
About what?
Collectivism.
Collectivism, community, and how African Americans do tend to, instead of going towards counseling, almost go to their own support system of friends and family. So get everybody involved in this process. Consulting with religious leaders at the client's request, of course. Providing services in a community setting. And psychoeducational outreach programs to educate about mental illness options and community resources. You want to be an advocate for the African American community.
That goes more towards social justice.
Absolutely.
Just one of the qualities of being a competent multicultural counselor.
So the overall takeaway here, acknowledge differences when appropriate. Be aware of culture-specific existence of prejudice and discrimination. Discuss race and ethnicity when appropriate. And more likely than not, it is going to be appropriate. If you think it's not, you're showing that you're scared to talk about it. And you will lose credibility with your clients. So when we say appropriate, it's more often than not, it's a topic that you do want to bring up oftentimes. It's the elephant in the room, and not talking about it is going to make a counselor look incompetent, a counselor look intimidated, and possibly bigoted or prejudiced in some way. So, you know, oftentimes it is appropriate to talk about it. We're going to talk a little bit about the Black Identity Development Model. And you do want to keep in mind this is not a one-size-fits-all kind of a thing. It is one theory developed by one person, William Cross. There are 5 stages to it, and of course there's always going to be a little bit of controversy regarding any sort of development model. Is it true? Does it fit for everyone? Is it kind of nature versus nurture? If a person is raised differently, is this going to, change? Can certain steps be avoided or skipped over entirely? But this is kind of the going model. We have the pre-encounter stage. Individuals consciously or unconsciously devalue their own blackness and concurrently value white ways. So there is a strong desire to be like the dominant group. In this case, if we're talking about African Americans in America, we are talking about black versus white, people trying to deny their blackness and assimilate to all things white. We have the encounter stage, where an event or series of events occurs to challenge the previous mode of thinking, and the world is reinterpreted. During this phase, there are feelings of anger and guilt for being brainwashed by white society. I believe the book that gives us the example of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and how for a lot of people that was a wake-up call. In case they weren't already aware, the world was not fair. This peaceful man was killed for trying to peacefully protest a lot of social injustice and racism, and for a lot of African Americans, that was a big wake-up call. They no longer wanted to be white. They were angry, and they wanted to do something about trying to fit into this culture that hated them, that hated, their leader, their peaceful leader. So that was a big historical example of an event that can happen in the encounter stage. The immersion stage, the person withdraws from the dominant culture and becomes immersed in African American culture. Pride begins to replace the previous feelings of guilt and anger. So for a lot of people, this means shunning white friends, surrounding themselves with African American friends only, adopting a lot of traditional African ways of dressing, music, so on and so forth. We have the internalization stage. Inner security exists, and the person is willing to establish meaningful relationships with whites who acknowledge and are respectful of his or her self-definition, ready to build coalitions with members of other oppressed groups. So you are now willing to, your feelings of anger are kind of, a little bit taking a backstage, and you're a little bit more peaceful. You're willing to be friends with people of other cultures, but you're now at a maturity level where you won't tolerate friends of other cultures who are not respectful of your culture. And then, of course, the internalization commitment stage. There is a commitment to social change, social justice, and civil rights that is expressed through action. It is anchored in a positive sense of racial identity. You're African American, you're proud to be African American, you see the injustices, and you're no longer just seeing them, but you've decided to take steps to address it, to change the world. And now what we have for you are a couple of interviews. Now, I don't know how, again with the audio, I don't know how this is going to pick up, but we've provided the YouTube links for you. Seth, I know you're definitely going to need to turn up the volume. We'll play it for you in case, but let's do Chrissy's first. For Seth's, you're definitely going to have to turn up the volume.
Okay.
Alright. What is your name?
Chrissy.
And your age?
30.
And Chrissy, where did you grow up?
Ashford Park, New Jersey.
And where do you live now?
Leonardo, New Jersey.
Okay, so got some smaller questions out of the way. This is a bigger one. What does being black mean to you?
Nowadays, it actually means a lot more. I guess I take my race a lot more serious, especially in light of a lot of things that have been taking place lately. So I guess being black, it means being human, but in the same term, it means being special because you're singled out a lot.
I'll agree with that. Okay, are you familiar with the term microaggressions?
No.
So essentially, it's kind of like, instead of overt racism, it's kind of like smaller things that are done or said on a daily basis, and even maybe friends say. I always give the example of like, oh, Asians are good at math. That's kind of a microaggression. It's
Okay.
still a stereotype, even though it may be kind of a positive stereotype, you're still assuming someone. So do you deal with anything like that from friends or people you deal with on a daily basis?
Not really, but I feel like like you said, there's stereotypes about every particular race. But I don't think I would necessarily deal with any stereotypes that I'm not really. I know I'm loud. I know I'm loud, so I don't really deal with any stereotypes that are necessarily associated to my race.
Okay. So then where in your life have you ever encountered more overt racism, more obvious racism?
I know that's job. Actually, and that's Dental Care. There was a lot of different races in and out, and I felt like my last manager was very racist.
In what ways? Do you have any examples?
Oh, any other race she called Muslim kids terrorists. So, tragic.
But towards you?
Honestly, I'd say I was pretty lucky because I've never directly had to deal with racism towards me.
And again, without getting too personal, have you ever had any form of counseling?
Yes, I've had counseling, not towards race, but I lost my daughter 8 years ago, so I've had counseling for that.
Okay. And either regarding that counselor or if you were to see a counselor again in the future for any reason, and they were of very obviously a different ethnicity or culture than you, what could they do to make you feel heard and understood and validated?
Just listen to me. I feel like racism, or race, so to speak, is taken a little bit too serious. If you treat everyone like a human and you talk to everyone the same way, then there shouldn't be a problem, so to speak. I feel like even though I'm a different race than you, we can still communicate in the same language.
Anything else you wanted to add?
No.
No. Thank you so much.
That's it.